So this is our lovely Lytton Springs. If you guys have had our wines before, it all goes into that one beautiful wine that we make. Now the vineyard itself is about 115 years old. The flats here planted around 1900, and the hillsides actually are about 125 years old. They were planted around 1890. But Rich started using Lytton Springs in 1972 when our then winemaker and actually current winemaker Paul Draper been with us since 1969.
Wow.
Yeah, really long run with us. Basically the only winery he's ever worked for, but of course he is a Zin genius. Actually was just named one of the 5 most influential winemakers in the world by Decanter magazine.
Really?
So, yeah, this last month. That was really special. Actually the only winemaker from the United States, which we're very. And with that, he's basically was chosen by his peers. So it's a bunch of winemakers and wine critics and influential people in the industry. That was really special. But anyway.
So what grapes are these?
These are mostly Zin. But
Okay.
this is what's called an Italian field blend. So it's Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, and Carignan mostly. And there's also about 20 other different varieties in this vineyard though. And we might have, like 1 or 2 vines of these different obscure varieties like Alicante Boucher and Mataro and Palomino, Mission, Pelerson. We have Syrah and Grenache in the vineyard. We have some Grenache Blanc in the vineyard, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we have 1 Pinot Noir vine.
Yeah.
And it is now 114 years old, so it's actually the oldest Pinot vine in, actually, probably California.
Yeah.
And, which is funny, because Rich has remade 1 Pinot Noir back in, like, 1971.
Yeah.
And we've never made a Pinot since, but we can claim we have the oldest Pinot vine.
That's funny.
It's funny. But we started using this vineyard when our winemaker met the then owner of this vineyard when they were out, actually, he was out wine tasting, and Paul was looking for vineyards like this, looking for very old, historic, vineyards with a sense of place. And Dick Sherwin and him started talking about their love of these super old Zinfandel vineyards that really are just found in this area. So Dick showed Paul the vineyard and decided that he did want to use it. Paul was the gentleman that named it Lytton Springs Vineyard. Dick Sherwin wanted to actually call it Valley Vista Vineyards because he thought that Lytton Springs wouldn't sell. Like, people wouldn't buy a wine if it was called Lytton Springs.
Yeah.
Jokes on him.
Yeah.
But we started using it in 72, and Paul actually named it Lytton Springs because he looked back through Sonoma County's very rich history and found out that they treat all of our wastewater on site. So that's pretty rare for a winery to have that kind of super in-depth water treatment process.
Yeah.
But basically how that works is when you, the wastewater from the winemaking process is very high in carbon. It's very sugar heavy. We have a lot of, seeds and skins left in that water. So what we do, and if we had taken that water and just put it directly on the soil, what would happen is there's microorganisms living in the soil that would eat that carbon for us. But what it would do is it would deplete all the oxygen in the soil, which is very bad for the ecosystem. So what we do is we treat the water with a little bit of ammonia or nitrogen, which is one of the main nutrients the bacteria need. And then we pipe it over to this first pond here, which we're, manually aerating, getting some oxygen back in the soil. But it's the bacteria living in the water that's eating that carbon for us. And then once the first pond is done, we then pipe it up to the second pond here, where there is another bacteria that doesn't use oxygen, that is finishing up eating any carbon or bigger molecules in the water. And then the last portion of the project is physically filtering it to our lovely pond here, which we will use for any, like I said, any irrigation, fire suppression if needed. Thankfully, it's not been needed. We have quite a bit of wildlife living in this pond as well. We have some fish and turtles and frogs, and we had a kingfisher living here. Around the time that we actually purchased this from Dick Sherwin in 1991, we also purchased our Lytton West property which you guys see that little hill that's half vine, half not vine? That's our east bench portion of the vineyard, and that's the very bottom of our Lytton West property. So over down the road about a mile, we have our Lytton West. It's 150 planted acres, purchased in 1995. And that's where we grow most of our Rhone varietals and east bench, and some younger Zin. We actually have some Primitivo planted there now, and soon we'll have some Surlienic, which is the genetic parent of Zinfandel and Primitivo. So do you guys know what Primitivo is? Have you heard of that varietal?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So we will have in the ground, hopefully within the next decade, some Zin, Primitivo, and the parent Surlienic Kostelianski, which will be really exciting.
Wow.
But might not make that for another 15 years, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So all this 50 acres you see is Lytton Springs. It is, like I said, mostly a field blend, but up here on the hills, we have mostly Petite Syrah. This soil being only about 6 feet deep before we hit the bedrock, which as you can see, the vines are just a little bit smaller. Life's a little hard for the vines on the hillsides. In the flats, we have a 40-foot soil depth before we hit the water table. So they're really happy. Most of those vines are Zin, so they tend to be bigger, bushier, really vigorous vines anyway. But up here on the hills, we actually get the best fruit of the vineyard. It's very concentrated, very intense. That doesn't give us too much fruit anymore. And actually, we are standing on one of the only hills that has predominantly Zinfandel. And you can basically, so the way of identifying a vine to decide what varietal it is called ampelography. And what you do is you look at the leaf structure and typically the cluster structure. So Zin is really easy to tell because the back of its leaves are very fuzzy. You guys can get in here and feel that if you'd like. It's actually the only variety that has that fuzz.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's most, you know, if it was a Chardonnay or a Cabernet leaf, they'd be very smooth. One of the other ways you can tell, actually this leaf's kind of deformed, but is the sinuses. So of the leaf structure, these large portions are called the lobes, and the little spaces in between are called the sinuses. Now Zinfandel is typically a very deeply sinused leaf. If it was, you know, Chardonnay, it actually would resemble more of this, so this poor leaf is a little deformed. It's probably easier to tell on some of the other leaves. Like this one here, both lobes or sinuses are very deep.
Right.
And the little piece that is attaching the leaf to the cane, this right here is called the petiole, and this sinus right here is called the petiole sinus. And for Zin, the petiole sinus will be lyre shaped and the back lobes almost touching. Oh. Now if this was like a Chardonnay leaf or like I said, Cabernet leaf, it would resemble more like this. The sinuses basically would be non-existent.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's kind of hard to see on this vine in particular. It's easier to see on this one over here, the structure of the clusters. So Zin tends to have a conical shaped cluster. So it's kind of a longer cone shaped, and then it's always winged. So if this was, you know, any other cluster, it might be shorter, it might be longer. But Zin, it's kind of easier to tell as well because it's one of the only varieties that has this nice little wing.
Little sad shoots.
Yeah, little secondary sad cluster. So we are at about 3 months of growth on our vineyard. It's now just starting veraison. So down at the flats it's a little easier to see. But about 3 months ago, the vine started waking up. It started doing photosynthesis again. We had bud break. And just about, you know, a week ago, we're going through what's called veraison, which is when these green berries will turn purple, and then the vine starts taking the acid inside the berry and converting it over to sugar. So as the berry ripens, basically sugar levels are going to rise and acid levels will drop. And it's when the acid and sugar is perfectly balanced that the winemaker decides it's ready to harvest.
So did that, they were talking about it yesterday.
But we actually didn't move up to Sonoma County and start working in Sonoma County until, well, we didn't own anything until 1991, which is when we purchased Lytton Springs from Dick Sherwin. But we did start working up here until about 1966, when we started using the Geyserville Vineyard, which was owned by Leo Trentadue. also a lovely Italian man.
To do. Okay.
Yeah, Trentadew. So actually today Geyserville's property is still owned by the Trentadews. We've just leased it forever, and we have the first rights to all of the fruit. This video, this is our irrigation and fire suppression pond. But kind of going back to our farming practices, like I said, we're all organic, and we use the integrative pest management. But we also have this other certification called fish-friendly farming, which is very, very specified to this area. And what the fish-friendly farming certification means is that we use very minimal tilling. We do not use any fertilizers, pesticides. We're going to take a sharp right-hand turn here. So, a woman who is building the first railroad from San Francisco to Sonoma County, and they together bought most of Alexander Valley and Dry Creek Valley from Healdsburg to Geyserville. So all of this beautiful, very expensive winemaking land, they used to be part of his estate. And he partnered with that guy who was building the railroad, and together they built the beautiful Lytton Springs Health Resort, which today is the Salvation Army. But they built this beautiful health resort, and the kind of draw for the resort was that we have actually naturally occurring carbonated seltzer water springs and mineral springs on our property.
Winery in this area.
The oldest winery in this area, well, the oldest winery in Sonoma County is probably Buena Vista Vineyards. They planted their first in 1850, but they're over towards like the actual town of Sonoma and Glen
Right,
Ellen.
yeah, we're
We've been there.
Yeah, they planted the first is in. Now the oldest winery in this area, it might be Simi, because they started, over 100 years ago.
Okay.
But there's a lot of older wineries like us. We've been working, all these louvers are controlled by Zenith. Let's track the temperature of the whole building, and we'll turn, which is called malolactic fermentation. So you guys probably have heard this reference to Chardonnay. If Chardonnay goes through 50% mallow or 50% mallow, typically it's just much creamier. Now all red wines. So here is the barrel red.
Whoa.
Chili in here.
Okay, so a little chillier. So this whole room has its own separate computer system for temperature tracking. It is kept at about an 80% relative humidity as well, so it feels a little more humid in here. So we have 2,400 barrels in this room. They are all stacked in this lovely diamond formation. Pretty unique for our winery. Now, every different row represents a new year. So we do build one of these rows every year. This is where the 2015 barrels are going to be. But all of the rows are actually done by hand. So we bring in the barrels when they're empty, and then we use these wedges and stack them high. And it's pretty cool when you look down the edge of the rows. That's all done by hand, but it's extremely precise.
Wow.
They are remarkable at building.
That is awesome.